Okay, so I see you're projecting the presentation. Well, my name is Bernardita Palacios. As Mete was mentioning, I work in the National Customs Service of Chile, and I'm going to talk to you today about preferential origin certification systems in FTAs in the case of Chile. Next slide, please. Thank you. Chile is a small but open economy with a vast network of trade agreements with a wide range of origin certification models. So we have 31 FTAs with 65 economies, 8 for trade law for least developed countries or LDCs, which we can group in around 6 origin certification systems. Next slide, please. So of course they can be grouped in different ways, but this one felt easier to present the data I want to show you today. So the 6 groups I am organized the information in are certification by competent authority, self-certification by the exporter, self-certification by the importer, exporter, or producer, certification by entity or declaration by the exporter, which is the European model, self-certification by the exporter or producer, and finally, the most flexible system, which is self-certification by the importer, exporter, or producer, or certification by competent authority, which is the system that we have allowed for LDCs. Next slide, please. So the different models chosen have depended on several factors, including subscription date of the agreement. In older agreements, the certification model by competent authority is more frequent, although there are also more recent agreements that still continue to have this scheme. The balance of risks, so to the extent that it is assessed that there is a greater risk, more conservative models have been chosen, such as certification by competent authority. And the interests of other parties. In some cases, the balance of the negotiations have led to different results in the certification system. Next slide, please. So I'm opening it because I can't read the bottom numbers for some reason. So I'm opening my slides. So thank you. So I wanted to show you first, give you a context of preferential imports by certification system. So this is aggregated data from 2016 to 2021. And here you can see that certification by a competent authority is the main system. It accounts for around 56% of all preferential imports in Chile. Followed with a 20% in the model of self-certification by the importer, exporter, or producer. And then the third most relevant system is that which mixes certification by competent authority or declaration by the exporter. Next slide, please. So I would like you to keep in mind the data I just showed you, because now we're going to compare it with the origin enforcement statistics. So the source of this statistics is the complaint and charges system of the National Customs Service, which in Spanish is Sistema de Denuncias y Cargos de CARE. So these are charges regarding origin irregularities in import declarations from 2016 to 2022. Charges that were either successfully challenged, for instance, in court, or dismissed internally, were not taken into account. And in this period, 2,230 of these charges were issued for a total of a little more than $12 million. Next slide, please. So this slide is the one that I wanted you to compare with the one of preferential imports. So you see here that if we see the number of charges by certification of origin system, we see that even though self-certification by the importer, exporter, or producer accounts for around 20% of preferential imports, it accounts for 43% of all the number of charges that were issued. So they are overrepresented in terms of charges. And then 44% of those by certification by competent authority, which is a little bit closer to what they represent in terms of all preferential imports. Next slide, please. So as I was mentioning, you can see that even though they don't represent as much of the preferential imports, they represent a lot of the origin-related charges when the agreements have self-certification by the importer, exporter, or producer. This occurs because in many cases when inspection takes place, it becomes clear that importers do not have effective and ascertainable knowledge that the good is originating. If you make a zoom in this data, you see that most of it is importers' knowledge. The exception of importers' knowledge is self-certification by the importer, exporter, producer, or certification by competent authority, which, as I already mentioned, is specifically for least developed countries, which have a very limited volume of trade, so they're not identified as an important risk source. So even though they do have self-certification by the importer, they do not represent an important fraction of charges issued in the enforcement area. Next slide, please. Thank you. So I'm going to, the next 3 slides, I'm going to show you the main irregularities within the main systems of certification, but I'm going to go over them rather quickly. So in the case of self-certification by the importer, exporter, or producer, which is the system I told you has a greater representation compared to their preferential imports representation, is that non-originating goods determined after an origin verification procedure, which it would be standard, and we could probably see this also in the case of competent authority. But the second most relevant category for irregularities is non-originating status recognized by the importer upon customs inquiry. This means the customs will send a questionnaire or some specific questions to the importer in order to assess whether they actually do have the importer's knowledge that the goods are originating. And in most cases, I don't have the cases, all the cases they ask for it, but in many cases you can see that they don't have the knowledge, or they don't have any way to ascertain that they do have the knowledge. And that is a big problem because they think they have the access to preference, but then they realized upon customs inquiry that they didn't. Next is that the proof of origin presented is an insufficient basis to sustain the originating status of the good, and then that the certificate of origin is not issued by an authorized person. I mean, in this case, it says competent authority, but it's because the category is included for both types of certification systems. But in this case, it means that it was not issued by an authorized person. It wasn't issued by the importer, exporter, or producer, to be specific. So next slide, please. In the case of certification by competent authority, it's a little bit different. The main source of irregularities is that the goods are classified in a tariff position with different or without preferential tariff treatment according to the agreement, followed by non-compliance with rules regarding direct transport and transshipment. And then those are the main ones. And then we have certificate of origin that does not cover all the goods declared under preferential tariff treatment, and non-originating goods determined after an origin verification procedure. Next slide, please. And this one is for all other certification systems. Since they were less representative, I grouped them together just so that you can see how the distribution changes if it's a different system. So this is pretty similar as in the prior slide of competent authority. Goods are classified in a tariff position with different or without preferential tariff treatment according to the agreement is the main irregularity, and followed by, I'm sorry, I can't see the description in the, I'm going to my slide. So it's followed by failing to present a proof of origin or certificate or other information that the goods qualified as originating according to the agreement and current regulation. Next slide, please. So more recently, the National Customs Service, in coordination with the Undersecretariat of International Economic Relations that they carry out the negotiations, have steered towards the negotiation of self-certification schemes to the extent that it is carried out by the exporter or producer, not the importer. There is a minimum data content, either in a certificate with a given format or in the commercial document. This information normally refers to the inclusion of the tariff classification, a description of the goods, identification of the parties, and compliance with the rules of origins, among other elements. They have to be appropriately linked with record-keeping requirements and origin verification procedures, and the balance of risks of the agreement allows it. So this makes it possible to reduce costs by making it easier to obtain a proof of origin without an additional intermediary, such as the competent authority. So last slide, please. So this has come up in the discussions we just had, so I thought it would be interesting to share our experience. So why self-certification by the exporter or producer and not by the importer? We have several reasons. So the producer has effective knowledge of the origin of the goods. It has a more direct relationship with the producer, and it's easier for them to prove effectively that the goods do meet origin requirements. It is more difficult for the importer to access sufficient information to prove the originating status of the good. On many occasions, a lack of knowledge of the applicable requirements and the production process of the good is evident upon inquiry, so that they declare that it is originating without having the supporting information. Therefore, upon verification of origin procedures, they cannot sustain the request for preferential tariff treatment. And although in the case of large importers or those with a stable commercial relationship with their suppliers, such as related parties, it is easier to access information regarding the originating status of the goods. For smaller operators or those who make sporadic purchases from certain suppliers, it may be more difficult to obtain the necessary information to prove compliance with the applicable rules of origin. So that's why we have trying to steer towards self-certification by the exporter or producer instead of the importer, even though we do have some systems by the importer. Thank you very much. That's the end of the presentation. So I'll be happy to hear any questions.